All right, we'll go ahead and get things kicked off. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be diving in a little bit more into total vegetation control for bareground sites today. A couple weeks ago, we did have a webinar on some more softer sites. Um, these places today we're going to be talking about are where nothing grows. If you're new to TVC, that's not something currently part of your program. We're talking about killing grass and broadleaves. My name's Tanner Smith. I'm going to be joined by Katie Koenig and Dave Mejia. These are your Corteva pasture and land management specialists who you're going to meet here soon. First off, just have a few housekeeping items. You'll probably notice already that your microphones and cameras have been disabled for this webinar, just to help with just kind of keeping that background noise down. We do have a Q&A tab active, so if you can move your mouse around and find the on-screen menu, you'll be able to interact with myself and the other hosts via that Q&A tab. Dave will be facilitating that Q&A tab, so he'll either stop Katie and I as we're presenting to answer some of those questions, or we'll hold those till the end of the presentation period. Again, thank you for joining our webinar here live today. And this is recorded, so if you're watching this after the live event on YouTube, thank you for also joining us as well. If this is your first Learning Lounge webinar, great. We do these, kind of semi-frequently during certain seasons. We did just, like I said, hold a soft Bareground Learning Lounge about 2 weeks ago. You can view that on our YouTube channel, Corteva AgriScience. Also, if you register for this event and you miss it, we'll send you a recording in your mailbox later. And those of you that are on here today, you'll receive that as well. So if you want to come back and look at this again, you'll be able to. I'll also let you know that on Tuesday, November 11th, we'll be hosting another webinar. And that one will be on why herbicides sometimes fail. We'll have presenters from Corteva like Dr. Will Hatler, and Jerome Otto, who has 30 years experience. So he'll be a wealth of knowledge from all the times he's seen some herbicide applications fail. Again, that's going to be November 11th. It'll be 9 to 10 and if you're in mountain time, or 10 to 11 if you're central time. So that webinar is going to primarily cover examples of various reasons why the herbicide applications sometimes fail, maybe don't meet expectations, and issues with, proper pest identification, product rates, selection, timing, calibration, kind of equipment best practices, and then weather and environmental factors will also be discussed there. And we'll get into a little bit of that as well on today's webinar. All right, so let's go ahead and meet the host for today's Learning Lounge. Again, my name's Tanner. I'm a vegetation management specialist for the Western Rockies and also the Great Lakes region. I started as a range of pasture and land management specialist in the summer of 2018, which was our first season as newly joined Dow AgriScience and DuPont Crop Protection, which is a global American-based pure play agriculture company here at Corteva. And outside of work, I love spending time outdoors with my friends and family. And speaking of family, I want to introduce you to my work family. So I love being a part of this passionate professional team, and our range pasture and land management team. We cover coast to coast, but in my immediate team here, you can see in this map represented, there's 10 of us. Great wealth of knowledge, and these are the folks where if we don't know something, we can go to this team, and more than likely they've seen something. So today I'm joined by Katie Koenig and Dave Mejia. So Katie, why don't you first introduce yourself a little more, and then we'll hear from Dave next.
Yep, absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Katie Koenig. I want to thank you all first and foremost for hopping on today. We've really appreciated being able to do these learning lounges and offer this resource for you all, and hopefully you all have seen some benefit. So as you can see on the screen, I covered territory number 7, or that area, and so that encompasses Western Kansas, western Nebraska and Colorado. And so my area is pretty dry, and a lot of the same weed spectrum that we see in Tanner and Dave's area. And so we are the range pod, small but mighty, and really, really looking forward and hoping you guys get some good information from today.
Hey, good morning, folks. Thanks for spending some time with us today. My name is David Mejia. I'm the newest addition to the Range Pod here at Corteva. I'm going to be your pasture and land specialist in number 5, which is Montana and Wyoming. Like Tanner said earlier, I'm going to reiterate it. I'll be hanging out at the Q&A, so please put some of your questions as we go throughout the presentation. I'll ask during the presentation, and a few of them I'll keep towards the end so that we can all go over it as a team. And again, let me just say, I'm really glad that all of you guys can join us. I'm very happy and excited to have you guys with us today. And with that, I want to turn it back over to Tanner to kick things off.
Thanks, Dave, Katie. Appreciate that. So, folks, you've got our contact info here. Definitely encourage you to reach out. If you guys remember that old adage, it isn't really what you know, it's more who you know. And we have a great team here represented, 30 plus of us coast to coast in our extended team. We're backed by, an R&D team that spends about $1 billion a year, which includes, folks that are in like a greenhouse setting, a lab setting, but also those local field scientists across, those diverse ecosystems that know these actual area really well. So if you don't get anything else out of today's webinar, I hope it is at least you know who you could reach out to when things get tricky. So what we're going to go through today uh, um, is kind of threefold. So when Katie and I were kind of preparing today's material and thinking about where we were going to go with this topic, kind of what came to our mind a lot is those sites where you're going in and day out. Maybe it's multiple seasons you've interacted with that site now and you're just not winning. Weeds are breaking through. There just inevitably seems to be, an issue, and we want to tackle that today. So we're going to get into kind of best management practices, and I'll take us through that. And then I'm going to transition over to Katie, who's going to talk more about herbicide options from Corteva and also kind of the broader industry as well. We'll look at some kind of field examples, and then we'll wrap up with any questions that we have left over. So before I get going now, I just want to ask, think to yourselves, how many of you have had site where, nothing seems to work year after year? Kind of get yourself in that mindset as well. And that's what we're going to move forward and tackle. Okay. All right, so let's start with the basics. So first, we're going to go over application timing, even water conditioning with pH levels, and then looking at our carrier volume, gallons per acre. So have you guys ever nailed, everything about an application, product choice, mixing, weather conditions were right, you got a really good rate out there, etc., but missed the timing window? That one detail can make or break a lot of those results. And there's some things we're going to talk through now of how we can help that. So think to yourself, what is that most common weed breakthrough in Bareground in your area? I'm sure there's going to be a lot of responses based off of the representation on today's call. Us here in the Western states, it's very common for us to see breakthrough of our favorite like kochia or Russian thistle. So if I'm going to look specifically at kochia, and a lot of this data would correlate with a lot of other, annual type weeds that are prevalent for breaking through. But kochia is one of the most, persistent and frustrating weeds in Bareground sites for a lot of areas, due to, maybe some ALS resistant biotypes, the fact that it produces just a lot of seeds every year. It can grow in some of the most crummiest soils. So it's really, really a big challenge for us. So this picture here, as you can see, is from North Platte, Nebraska. And this is showing seedlings that have emerged in February. So note that's February 21st. Kochia doesn't always wait for what we would maybe box in as the term spring. So research done by University of Nebraska shows that kochia can be germinating as low in soil temperatures as low as about 39 degrees. Okay. So that's just barely above freezing. That's probably still within, freeze and thaw cycles. So this can start popping up really early before we might even be ready for it. So have you ever shown up to a site like in March in your area and you're planning to apply like a pre-emergent and you're seeing what we see here in this picture? You've already got kochia popping up. So what are we going to do to win this battle? So there's a couple things I'll go through. So something that I found that's really helpful for applicators that are staying up on top of weeds like kochia that are emerging early is look at some of your historical weather data. So at least from a planning phase, kind of wrap your head around understanding your area. This can be a really powerful tool. So a lot of like state extension agencies or even like weather databases like NOAA is one of my more favorite. You can look at this historical data and you can start looking at averages of that local climate. And that'll get us close, right? That's not going to be the end all be all, but certainly as we're planning work for this season, especially again on those sites that are breaking, the weeds are breaking through. Maybe fine tuning our timing to a little bit earlier can help. Okay. Um, if you know kochia was likely to germinate 2 weeks earlier, and then say when you sprayed last year, how would you adjust your schedule moving forward? And that's really what we're looking at here is just having a plan before we're going in ahead of the time. We don't want to be reacting to those weeds. We kind of want to be more predicting when they're going to pop up. So, and again, always nice to be ahead of the weeds, but inevitably you're going to show up to an area or you're just not going to have enough time to get everywhere um, for the most optimal cases. So, what are we going to do at that moment when we show up to a site? It's March. Yeah, we had early emergence in February, like this example. What are we going to do? So, Katie's going to go over a little bit more in depth of like specific tank mixes to account for these instances, but essentially we need to be prepared to alter our method of attack at that site. So we will need to add what we call a post-emergent mode of action to the tank, so something that offers more burn down. But we also want to put down the pre-emergent at that time as well, because we do expect when temperatures start to get even warmer that there's going to be other flushes of weeds, especially as we start to have moisture events. These annual weeds, they can show up within hours of a moisture event. So adding that post-emerge product to our pre-emerge program, we might be talking 5 to maybe even $20 an acre addition of chemical. But think about what is your cost per acre if you're going to have to make a return trip for a second application because again our timing wasn't right. We didn't have the right products in the tank, and we're not holding those back. Always wise to keep a burn down product on the truck, even if it's not in the tank, just so you can add it kind of in those last minute scenarios. Um, let's talk about germination versus emergence. So when I say the term germination, what I'm referring to is when the seed begins to break from the seed husk. So, or excuse me, the seedling begins to break from the seed husk. So this is going to occur underground unless you're going to disturb the soil and go look at those seeds. This is not something you're going to be able to recognize readily. Emergence is when that new sprout is going to break through the soil. Now it's in contact with, the UV from the sun. That's well beyond germination. So when doing a pre-emergent program, a lot of herbicides are going to be most effective in that pre-germination timing. Okay, so this is basically you're putting down product before the seed has even broke its husk, not just before the seedling has emerged above the soil. Really, once the seed germinates, it's already too late in a lot of cases for many herbicide products. And if we're not also in that first, 3/4 of an inch of soil yet, we haven't been incorporated, it's going to be hard for chemistry performance to to be met. So as you can see here on this calendar, we're looking at, best application timings are usually going to be, fall to springtime. Now, I will point out that, even though I have December and January checked off here, that's not going to be for everyone's area. So I myself, cover a lot of northern geographies. We're going to have frozen soil. We're going to have snow present. We can't make applications to frozen soil or snow. But if you're living in areas where you do have open ground in the winter, that's still a good time to apply product if your local conditions do allow. Excuse me, hit the wrong button there. So target weeds before they germinate, to summarize. Pre-emergent herbicides, they work by creating that chemical barrier in the soil. So that's going to be, that shield protection on top. We'd love for that to also be incorporated with a little bit of moisture in that first 3/4 inch of soil. This is very critical for some of those hardest to control weeds like the annuals that produce just a lot of seed. They're not going to be spreading via rhizomes or family root systems. So a good thing to remember is attack the weak link, prevent the seedling. Okay. Cool season germinators, they usually start really early. Weeds like kochia, like we saw in February at 39 degrees Fahrenheit soil temperature. So what we love to recommend here at Corteva is applying in the fall as much as possible, or even early winter. Again, we're not applying to frozen soils. We still want to be above the freezing temperature. We don't want to have snow present like like in December or January. But if you are in an area that has open ground, that's fine. And really, it comes down to when you're planning that work is would you rather, chase the weeds in March or April or block them like in October? It's going to be a lot more effective in the fall, especially when we consider a lot of these products need moisture to activate them and considering also longevity like residual in the soil. Fall and winter precipitation usually help activate these chemistries, get them to where they need to be. Um, Cooler temps also slow microbial breakdown. So a lot of herbicides are metabolized by bacteria that makes them ineffective. That's essentially why they're running out there in the soil. So extending the herbicide longevity is definitely going to help by applying in the fall as well, due to soil microbial activity. All right, let's jump into water conditioning now. So this is something that's often overlooked. Most folks, I think, recognize that if you're going to use a glyphosate product, that it's critical for water conditioning. But I want to point out that glyphosate's not going to be the only one we need to worry about. And just think for a second, like when you're loading up your spray program, what is that percent solution of herbicide relative to water? So in most cases, the the water is going to make up, that 95-ish% of your spray volume. So it is by far the majority of what will be applied. And I think a lot of times we take for granted that it's just water, like it's kind of our universal general solvent, a weak solvent at that. It's a very weak solvent. So while it's easy to think of water as maybe neutral, it's not always the case. So if you haven't measured your water of where you're filling up your source or different sources near your sites, I definitely would invite you guys to start checking on that. And I highly encourage it. So hard water contains ions like calcium, magnesium, and iron, and these can bind up the herbicide molecules, forming complexes that reduce uptake and effectiveness. So have you ever used a product you trust, you follow the label, and still didn't get control you expected? It might not be the herbicide, it might be that 95% solution in the tank, which is the water. So here's why it matters. Hard water can neutralize herbicides. So when ions bind to those active ingredients, they can prevent the herbicide from entering plant. And this is going to be especially problematic for any systemic herbicides that rely on translocation. So any of the good stuff, right? You do have some options to combat this. So you can increase your herbicide rate. So you're essentially putting in more product that's going to be more that sacrificial bind up those ions. That's a pretty common method, like in the ag industry, but for these more expensive, concoctions that we're using for TVC, that can be really costly. And if you're already running the max label rate, you don't really have a legal flexibility of adding any more. So that's where we recommend using a conditioner for the water, um, something like an adjuvant that's going to tie up those hard ions first before we add product to the tank. So by softening or modifying the spray solution, you reduce that variability across the sites and seasons. And this is going to be especially important when moving between regions with different water profiles. There's numerous conditioning agents available. Choosing the right one will just depend on your herbicide mix, your water source, and target species. Some applicators even carry portable water hardness test kits. I always recommend having at least like a litmus paper to check on the site, just so you know where you're at. Okay. If you're not familiar with using water conditioners, reach out to your chemical supplier. There's a lot of different ones in the market. Those guys are usually really good at helping you adapt one to your spray program. So remember, if water makes up 95+% of the tank, it really does matter. Use an adjuvant, make the water work for you. Here's kind of an example of some herbicides breakdown um, according to water pH. So actives that are more sensitive to hydrolysis, and hydrolysis is basically the term of when herbicides or chemicals basically break down in water. So flumioxazin, glyphosate, of course, and then any of our ester triclopyr actives, those are going to be more sensitive to degrading in higher pH. Note this chart on your screen. This is the half-life of flumioxazin in water. This is research from an organization in Florida. Notice at a 9 pH, so I'm looking here on the y-axis, that top left data point, virtually at a 9 pH, basic, there's essentially minutes that this is going to be active in the tank. So if you're going to load up early in the morning and be spraying that tank through the afternoon, it's going to look different. It really will. If we bring that pH down to say like a neutral level, um, that's going to last more like 20 hours, which definitely gets you through the day. But if we are looking at bringing that pH down to like a 5 or a 5.5, that's where we really get some extreme longevity with a particular active like flumioxazin. So again, water definitely matters. Other products that aren't really as sensitive to pH would be like our Milestone family or the choline salt version of triclopyr, which is Vaslan. Not as pH sensitive, a little bit more flexibility there, kind of more of a bulletproof chemistry. So also, we want to be worried about chelation. So chelation is basically what happens when water ions in hard water, like the calcium, magnesium, iron, basically bind to the herbicide molecules, which would make the chemistry ineffective. So that's what basically forms those complexes. Way harder for plants to absorb them. It's going to look like an unsatisfactory application if you have chelation occurring. So glyphosate, really notorious for that process. All we need to do is just bring down that pH before adding in something like a glyphosate. Um, So this is an example here of a really cheap and an effective way of testing your pH. These are basically litmus paper. I've found these on Amazon. I find them at Walmart, basically any spa supply company. A lot of ag stores will have these. A really cost-effective way. Keep them in the glove box. Throw your gloves on. Check your water. The color changes. You match it up with the container. Usually, it's really easy to see. So process is really straightforward. Just collect, a water sample from your spray source, um, your water source that you're filling up, the well or the tank, etc. You can use a pH meter, a little bit more expensive, $5 to maybe $100, depending on how accurate you want to get, or these litmus papers. Usually, we're looking between 5 and 7, between maybe 5.5 and 7 pH is ideal for most chemistries. And is it expensive? Not really. The time you take to slow down and measure the water is definitely going to be more cost effective than having to come back for a second application if we have any type of failure. The conditioners you can buy, usually we're talking, a couple tablespoons per, hundreds of gallons. So pretty cost effective to get one of those. And especially if, your water is 95+%, it definitely matters. Um, This is a generalized map of water hardness across the US. So I wanted to show this because I know we have a diverse group here on the call today. Again, this is, an average of water hardness. So most folks that I work with out here in the West, they're looking at some pretty hard water. We definitely use a lot of conditioners when we're doing spraying. Folks that are kind of down more in that central south area, they have a lot more flexibility with their water. So just something to remember that there's good data out there for averages, but nothing beats just testing your water right there in the field. Let's talk next about carrier volume. So I'm talking gallons per acre that you're running through your rig. And this is another one that's often overlooked, especially with TVC. So a lot of ag guys, they can usually run 10 to maybe 20 gallons per acre on their broadcast rigs when they're just doing field weed management. But when we're talking about a pre-emerge program, we need a lot more than just those ag rates. So um, always good to ask yourself, are you adjusting your gallons per acre based on the product that you're putting in the tank or just kind of sticking to what's always worked? So here's the deal with carrier volumes. So higher volumes mean better spray coverage. Essentially, more droplets equal more surface contact and less drift. And then we look at contrast that with lower volumes. Those let you cover more ground per tank, which is nice. You're not chasing water as much, but they come with some trade-offs. So you can get some higher drift risk, especially if we're trying to run maybe some higher pressures out of our pump, and we can get less consistent coverage. Okay, so these are generalizations. Not all jobs will allow flexibility of increasing water. However, when we think of the site that has unsatisfied weed control, consider using more water on that job in particular. Um, Given all other details of the application are correct, this can definitely make a difference. So let's break it down by kind of more active types. So for contact herbicides, so think of like your glufosinate, those definitely need high volume, high carrier volumes. They work by touching the plant surface so that, it's in a post-emerge scenario. So coverage is going to be everything. More systemic herbicides like glyphosate or 2,4-D, any of like our milestone family, those are going to move through the plant internally. They can be effective at lower volumes, but only if the conditions are right. Also note, lower volumes is achievable with emerge weeds that have large surface areas thanks to those leaves. But what about that pre-germination fall or early spring application? How will GPA, gallons per acre, and coverage matter in this scenario? So remember, with any pre-germination application, you want to apply a herbicidal shield on that soil. The better consistency that barrier is without gaps in between, the better that weed control is going to be long term. Um, the last learning lounge, we talked a little bit about KOC values with different chemistries. It's essentially the quantifiable measurement of how well or not well a chemistry can move through the soil. And essentially, systemic and very soil mobile actives, those give you a lot more flexibility of having those gaps because they're going to move through the soil to kind of fill that barrier shield. But very soil immobile actives, which we love in sensitive sites because they're not moving into areas we don't want them. Those are going to be harder to get the same coverage at lower volumes. So something to consider is we need to up those volumes when we have soil mobile actives. Okay. Another generalization here, if we consider kind of that low GPA for Bareground, that's going to be between kind of that 50 to 100 gallons per acre. It's fast, it's efficient, but we do have risk involved with poor coverage. Kind of that more medium GPA, 100 to 150, that's going to be a lot more balanced. We're not going to be chasing as much water, say the 150 plus, right? But we're gonna have still some really good coverage. And then high GPA, obviously excellent coverage, but it's going to be way more labor. We're going to need larger equipment. That one's going to be harder to achieve. So usually between that low to medium, 50 to 150 is usually the range you want to be. If you're at 50 or even less, and you're having weeds emerge on you, this would be something to consider changing for the next season. This graphic here I have shown is all about choosing kind of the right nozzle and understanding the relationship between three key variables, which would be the droplet size, my carrier volume, and my spray coverage. So think of it like this. If I'm going to double, or if I'm going to double the droplet size. So if I'm moving from like a 250 micron size droplet to like a 500 micron droplet, there's going to be 1/8 fewer droplets, so about 12% less droplets in that spray. Okay, so something to consider there. It's not just math there. It's really just a reminder that coverage is a numbers game. So fewer droplets obviously mean fewer chances to hit our intended target. And we have a lot of targets when we're talking pre-emerge because we want just a really good, consistent soil barrier cover. Really good pro tip here is remember larger spray volume, larger droplets, less drift, and more coverage. Again, our upcoming webinar in November is going to deep dive more into um, why sometimes applications fail or we have kind of unsatisfactory results. But from what we talked about today, just remember using that correct rate, make sure the application setup is done right. We want to condition our water. We want to fine tune our timing, moving more spring applied to more fall, definitely preferred of the two. Increasing our coverage, our carrier volume if needed, going for a nozzle selection to kind of fine tune our coverage. Pressure is always a big one as well. The higher pressure we run, remember that's going to create kind of more of a foggy or mistier scenario, which can increase our drift, even though it does help with coverage because we have a finer droplet. Environmental conditions do matter and they can sabotage success really quickly. So high heat, wind, really low humidity, any type of temperature inversion, those are obviously going to increase our drift and volatility issues, but also they can make that chemistry not look like it's going to be working right as well. So heavy rainfall, another one to remember, that can wash off or break down herbicides prematurely. Definitely saw that recently in Minnesota. We got a 16-inch rain event and basically nothing stayed on site. It was really unfortunate. So something to be aware of. A lot of our chemistries here at Corteva have a rain fast of 2 hours or less. But if we're going to have heavy deluge, remember that's going to dilute our chemistry for one, and then two, if it's heavy enough to move soil particles, that's going to take our herbicide with it. Herbicide performance isn't just about the product. Sometimes mixing and label alignment with target species are going to be the most critical step. Many herbicides do require moisture after application, and complete lack of thereof can make it look like a failed or unsatisfactory application. So I'm going to go ahead and transition over to Katie. She's going to take us through kind of more of these herbicide options, and we're going to look at a couple of field results. So Katie, I'll hand it over to you, and then Dave will take us through the Q&A next.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Tanner. Yeah, so we're going to go through some herbicide options. If any of you were on our last Learning Lounge that talked through more of our sensitive site options, today we're obviously going to be talking through more of those heavy or hard Bareground options. And what I mean by that is that a lot of, or most of the products that I'm going to talk through would not be appropriate to be spraying up next to sensitive ornamentals or sensitive sites, water, trees, ornamentals, vineyards, anything specialty. So again, thinking more of that heavy Bareground site, your lots, parking lots. You can see here we've got a picture of some tank batteries. This is where these herbicide options are more going to be used. Again, kind of just bringing up and re-highlighting, a lot of these herbicides we're going to talk through are most effective pre-germination. So again, that doesn't mean emergence. That means before the seedling breaks from the husk. And so it's much of what we don't see, what's going on below ground, but the herbicides are most active and can be used to the best of their potential when it's before that germination stage. So let's get into some of these options here. So we're going to talk through two different, obviously our post, which is going to be that burn down. So this is if we do have something emerge. You can see here that obviously in this picture there was kochia emerged when they went into this site. And then on the right, we're also going to talk about pre-emergence, which really I feel like we should just change it to the term pre-germination, because as we know, emergence isn't really the finite detail there. We kind of showed a calendar of ideal timing. I completely understand a lot of you are spraying a lot of acres, and to get on every acre in 3 months is not feasible, especially when we're hoping Mother Nature has the wind blowing below 10 to 15 miles per hour, which is only a few days out of the year when where I'm at in Kansas. So there's obviously a lot of factors there. So we're not saying that it's not, the end all be all if you are not getting your pre-germination, your pre-emergent product down. We just obviously need to know the appropriate steps to take when that weed may be up and growing by the time you get to that site. So our first product here we're going to talk through is Piper EZ. So this isn't a new herbicide. Some of you may already be using or have used Piper herbicide, which would be the original WDG formulation. But when Corteva started distributing Piper EZ, we were able to change that formulation to a liquid. So Piper EZ is still the same combo of flumioxazin and pyroxylphone, but now instead of in a WDG formulation, we have it in a new liquid formulation. Most of you are familiar with Flumi, that it's used often in Bareground applications, but I sometimes get a lot more questions on this second active pyroxylphone. And really, the pyroxylphone is the heavy lifter in Piper. So if you work at all in crops, there's actually a standalone pyroxylphone active in the crops world, and that is really what's really extending our half-life on our residual. And so this is an excellent tool for providing pre-emergence, and the Flumi does offer some early post-emergent. But again, the key goal here is to get it pre-germination, and if there is anything up, then you would need to add a post-active in the tank. But Flumi, the pyroxylphone combo, is excellent and really excels on those Russian thistle, kochia species. And that's where we've seen a lot of great success there. But again, very dependent on what happens after the application, moisture level. It does take some moisture to get activated, and then making sure we get it down at the appropriate timing. Our next one here that may not be as familiar to some of you that are in the total vegetation control world, but this is our product, High Noon. So we use High Noon in the West. It is a liquid formulation of aminopyrrolate and rinsecore, but many of you also may be familiar with TerraView, which is the same thing, but in a WDG formulation. And so based on these two actives, the heavy lifter for our residual is going to be aminopyrrolate. So if any of you do any type of selective broadleaf weed control, you're familiar with Milestone. That is what aminopyrrolate is. The only difference here is that with High Noon or TerraView, we can double our rate of aminopyrrolate. So essentially, when we go through our options here, our recommendations, we're using a 2x rate on TVC. And so that's essentially giving us 14 ounces of Milestone. And so we've actually seen aminopyrrolate does a good job pre-germination, but it also offers some, that right in between that phase of post-germination, but before it emerges, is showing some activity there on certain species. And so High Noon or TerraView can be used to enhance your TVC control options, again, in those heavy or hard bare ground sites, and then used in a lot of different industrial right-of-way use sites as well. One of our next one, which may be a sore subject to some if you've been in the TVC world for a while, but really want to reintroduce it, is Spike 80DF. And so the active in Spike, this formulation is a dry flowable, and the active is tebuthiazide. And so again, I know many prior to even before I started my role, a lot of people had used Spike as a standalone or even as a tank mix partner. And one thing to watch out with spike is it can move when used at high rates. And so when we use spike ADDF, I like to use it in combination and just throw in, a pound of active. We're not talking 5 or plus pounds of active per acre. I'm adding in a pound really just as my insurance to really hammer on those sites where maybe we didn't get out there in time to get the kochia pre-germination. This is also on the approved list for BLM or U.S. Forest Service sites. So if we do have any of you, we know our list for approved herbicides on public land is limited, but Spike ADDF is one of those products that can be used on those lands. And again, we're going to run through some examples of where maybe throwing that in the tank as some insurance on kochia would be beneficial. Another one here I want to highlight, again, this is just a premix of aminopyrrolate and metsulfuron methyl, but again, also labeled for the BLM and U.S. Forest Service. So we cannot use that 2x 14-ounce rate of milestone with open site, but we can still get 7 ounces out. And when you start comboing that with spike or other actives, again, we're really focusing here more as just an option that you would have for BLM or Forest Service sites or public land sites that you can't go with a high noon or you can't go with some other products. Some other industry actives, residual, again, more or less want to promote tank mixing as much as possible, especially when we start getting into post burn down actives. But other actives that you can use would be indaziflam, imazapyr, aminocyclopyrrochlor, diuron, and bromosil. And so again, you can kind of see the newer chemistries more towards the top, and then as you get down into those older chemistries, using high rates, a lot of pounds per acre when you talk through, diuron, bromosil. But again, really trying to hone in, indaziflam is another prime example. It is optimal pre-germination if you're going to get it out. You really start to lose your efficacy after germination, or even definitely after emergence. Another active I actually really like in this group and like adding in is imazapyr. That is a great option to add in if you have, I've seen it really excel in that perennial grass space. So if you have some perennial grasses that you're struggling with to get, I really like adding in imazapyr, and I think it is a great active to add as well. So as we kind of look at some posts, so we did talk through these on the sensitive site TVC Learning Lounge a couple weeks ago, but Freelex would be our 2,4-D formulation. So where this becomes more of that sensitive site space is the choline formulation. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with LV6, the ester formulations. And then as you go down the line, you get into your amine, which is a little bit less volatile, but truly the lowest volatility that the EPA will register a product has been our 2,4-D choline. And so even if you would say I'm spraying tank batteries out in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, and you have a sensitive crop that is up and actively growing, no, you don't need to probably worry so much about, the piper you're putting down, but what is your post product in the tank with it? And so that this is a great 2,4-D option that if you were worried about it moving, and if there's anything up around the site, even if the site itself may be a hard Bareground site. Another one that we love to include here for, especially our kochia, when we have kochia up and Russian thistle up, is fluroxapyr. And so Vista XRT is our brand of fluroxapyr. And again, really trying, especially when we're going after kochia, to try and get away from those resistance biotypes, the fluroxapyr, adding it in, especially in combo with something else as a post burn down, is a great option there, especially like I said for kochia, which seems to be a pretty predominant break. This is not going to have much control post on grass species, but it will be really good on a lot of other broadleaf weed types. Other industry actives here post-emergent, I put the active kick score, but that is essentially sharpen And then obviously we think of dicamba, glyphosate, 2,4-D ester, glufosinate, some other really predominant burn down that we see added into the tank. So here I've got an example. Again, this was a post burn down. This is a new site here, the new Ellis County Weed Director's office. They had some kochia up. And I would say it's got some height to it. So another key thing to controlling kochia is timing on it. You don't want to get it right when it's a seedling just emerged, kind of like what we showed you in that first slide from the University of Nebraska. I call it the button stage, where it's really fuzzy still. But you also don't want the kochia to be as tall as me when you're going out and trying to control it. And so you can see here, this site, they treated it in July. Pictures were taken 3 weeks after treatment. Ideally, I know you guys want to spray kochia or any of our post products. You want to spray it and you want it to be crispy brown by the time you're leaving the site or by the time the end of the day comes around. And I want to really express that fastest kill that we think of, crispy brown, sometimes isn't always the best method. And so you can see here, these pictures were taken 3 weeks after treatment. If you would have went back a week after treatment, you probably would start to be questioning the application still. But I really want to show that we ran 10 ounces of Vista with 10 ounces of dicamba, and we got 100% control of the kochia. It just didn't look maybe 100% killed 1 week after treatment, which is okay. We know for sure we're getting a good solid kill on the plant or control rather than just a quick burn, which is how we get into a lot of our resistance issues in the first place. So really trying to stress that in those post applications, fastest isn't always better. We're going to go through again some examples. A lot of these were through sites that I work with here in my location in Kansas. So this is kind of when we really started introducing our high noon Piper combo. So you can see they ran high noon at 40 fluid ounces. Again, they're getting out 14 ounces of milestone in that application, and they ran it at the max rate of 20 ounces of Piper EZ. Treated in March. So a couple things to note, this site is on a March cycle. So it was bare to begin with. It's not like we had to add anything post in the tank. You could obviously still throw in glyphosate if you thought there may be something up or any of the post products, but they were on a cycle here. And so the pictures were taken in August of 2023. Now I mentioned these sites had been previously sprayed. So of course the first thing that came up was, well, how do you know what wasn't sprayed the year prior isn't what's still holding through? And so this is the exact same site, again, treated March 2024. So double, same application, same site, and you can still see it. It's as clean as a whistle. And so, again, really happy with this, the application and what they've got going here. Another site here, so treated November 2023. Pictures are taken July 2024. This would be, again, high noon at 40 fluid ounces per acre, and then a combination of Piper EZ herbicide at 20 ounces per acre. Again, this is a maintenance site. It's on a cycle. It's on a November cycle, so we didn't really have to worry about having a lot of posts in the tank, but just and again, acknowledging, do you have a maintenance site? Are you on a new site? Is there anything up? You know, all those factors are taken into consideration. Here, so these tank batteries had been here before, but the guys maintaining this site had brought in new dirt. And so again, we're talking about new dirt that who knows what's in it as far as the seed bank that's in this dirt or soil. And so when they built this up, we're essentially starting fresh. So we can't say that, you know, previous actives have been here before. We really are starting fresh, but there was no weeds up and actively growing when this application was made. And you can see again, it was our high noon at 40 ounces with our Piper EZ at 20. So if you guys are using TerraView, the high noon at 40 ounces is equivalent to TerraView at a 5.7. So again, that 2x rate. And all of these applications were done by the same applicator, and they were done at 100 gallons per acre as well. and treated November 2023, pictures taken July 2024. Again, High Noon 40, Piper EZ 20, 100 gallons per acre. This is kind of that site I'm talking about. Let's say there was something up and active, if they got in, were to go do this application later in the year, April, if they would have had wheat, or even March, if there was wheat in that field around it, that's where we would have to start being a little bit concerned about what posts we would have in the tank. Not so much because of the application site. And so that's, again, just something to watch out for if you were to need a post in the tank with it. Transitioning more up into more of the Pacific Northwest. So we've got, again, this is a site in Oregon, treated early spring 2024. Pictures were taken July 2024. You can see High Noon at 40 ounces, Piper at 20, and then they did add in glyphosate at 40 ounces per acre, and then again also at 100 gallons per acre. Location in Utah, treated October 2024, pictures taken 2025. You can see this is actually a solar field, and so they've treated the substation for Bareground, and I'm assuming there was probably no weeds up here when they did this application. So again, mainly just maintaining a site. High Noon 40 ounces, Piper EZ 20. So this is when we start getting maybe into a little bit later in the year, later spring. Kochia would have obviously been up and actively going. We probably would have missed that first, pre-germination window. So the location actually here was in close to that North Platte, Nebraska area. So what this applicator went out with was High Noon, High Noon at 40 ounces per acre, or TerraView at 5.7. Piper EZ at 20, and then they did add Spike 80DF at 8 ounces. Again, we're not talking a lot of pounds here, 8 ounces per acre. And then they also had glyphosate and Vista in the tank as well. So, you may be thinking, why the heck would they go to this extreme? Again, a lot of it's coming down to what was there, what was going on in that site. This is around a feedlot. So again, like I said, in March, a lot of stuff would have already been up and actively growing. They've got curly dot coming in off the bank, kochia, looks like there's some smooth brome, so we're talking about some perennial grasses. So they really did need to up, but it really just goes to show when you look at a maintenance site on a yearly cycle versus maybe something that you had to go treat that maybe got away from you, or we're later in the year than what we had expected due to weather delays, and how they had to alter their mix. And so to kind of wrap this up, when I think of for added kochia control, if you're in the Western U.S., kochia can be a burden. And so our recommendation, High Noon at 40 ounces and Piper at 20 does a great job if everything is right and ideal, maintenance sites. But if you are getting into those areas where maybe we are starting to be concerned if we miss that first germination window, or if we know that there is some issues with kochia breakthrough, this is where I would add in the Spike 80DF. You can add it in at 16 to 20 ounces, but as you saw in the last one, even adding in at 8 ounces per acre. And that really limits our worry of any type of movement. You saw on that last slide, there was a pretty firm, I'll go back to it, a pretty firm line of where it was treated and where it wasn't. We don't see a lot of, if there was soil movement, that would be one thing, but we do not see a lot of leaching in this picture. And so that really goes back to, our appropriate rates. I mentioned I really like imazapyr and Bareground applications. So I've obviously recommended times where you're going to go, especially if you have a lot of perennial grasses that you're worried about breaking through, or even bindweed, which is another really tough perennial to manage. We would do that High Noon, 40 ounces, and Piper EZ at 20, and then add in that 48 ounces of Arsenal. And again, these are very still economical options to be running. So if you were just going to run High Noon or TerraView Piper, you're more around that $100 range per acre. But if you start adding in other stuff, Arsenal, Spike, those still are pretty affordable options to have in the tank. and come out well under some of the other industry actives. So to really wrap it up here, deciding what I need for a program, we went through best management practices. We've obviously gone through some of the recommendations that we've seen, we promote, that we know work, but key things to note is our application timing. Obviously, if we can get it pre-germination, ideal timing's fall, but that isn't always the case for us depending on what Mother Nature decides to throw our way. Then one of the next factors is understanding, is a post-emergent burn down needed in the tank? Are we doing a new or a maintenance site? I was humbled real quick. I went to go put out some trials on a brand new site because I know everybody loves to say if you're putting the chemical out on a site that's already been sprayed, how do you know it's working? So I went and found some woolly sites, kochia skeletons as tall as me, and I was quickly humbled by my GPA mattered the most when making that application. It didn't matter what chemical I put out. When I ran a lower GPA compared to a higher GPA, that made a difference because I needed to get soil contact. So understanding that and acknowledging that. What is surrounding the treatment site? We've already discussed, sensitive sites, different than maybe a hard TVC site, but understanding that matters as well, and to decide for sure what you need in a program. And then lastly, the thing on everybody's mind is what is your budget for that site? And so that also plays into consideration of deciding, but I would say that what we showed today are economical, middle of the road options that are not going to break the bank and be able to stay under many people's budgets. And then finally, why do applications sometimes fail? We talked through the two biggest chunks of it, which is our application factors and our environmental conditions. But evaluating our herbicide post-performance. Was the product effective in the past? So I showed you examples 2 years after it worked great, but maybe this year that same combo went out and kochia broke through. Was that a herbicide failure, or were there other factors at play? Is the weed species listed on the label? Key thing there. We don't want to be spraying a product and then if a cedar tree comes through, we're like, hey, why did that come through? And understanding that's not on the label. So we have to take that into consideration. Was the product within shelf life and stored properly? A lot of products need to be kept at room temp. We do not want them to freeze. Again, making sure all those things are done properly, not left out in sun, where UVs can have access or left in the tank all day. And did we not receive the appropriate moisture after application? So again, right back to Mother Nature. A lot of these actives need a moisture event to get them activated and going. We don't need a 16-inch gully washer, but we also need sometimes at least up to 1/4 of an inch to get these actives going. With that, again, short term, considering a follow-up application, if your herbicide application didn't go well, the last thing we would want is to have to go back and clean up an area. But if you do know what your follow-up application post-burn down options would be, one of the great things about working with a company like Corteva is we stand behind our products, and so we are in the field able to go service those, evaluate what went wrong and help you guys build a plan to make sure it doesn't happen again. We don't want to see these applications fail. And so we want to work with you long-term to make sure that we're correct, choosing the correct mode of action, we're doing the correct timing, we're doing the correct rates, and we are applying in the correct environmental conditions. So with that, we'll open it up to questions. I know we're kind of right at the hour, but I think we've had some good discussion here. I would also promote this QR code takes you to vegetationeducation.com, which is one of our online platforms that's free for anyone that maybe wants to just go on and sharpen up on some of those, why herbicides sometimes fail, mixing, handling. And if you haven't already, I highly recommend checking out this website. So Dave, I will turn it over to you.
Perfect. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that QR code. We had a good question come up from Taylor. They're actually asking us about whether or not we can state if a product is labeled for use in a specific state. They mentioned California. I did on that the Q&A, I linked a great link, which is the vegetationmanagement.com. So there's an area where you guys can jump on there and select your state, and it will list off all the products that are labeled for use. So if any of you guys, Katie or Tanner, have some feedback for that specific question when it comes to finding specific help with questions that we have, what are some other resources that you guys can think of?
No, I think that's, yeah, great. I think you mentioned California, which unfortunately there's not a lot of great options. You guys did just get TerraView CA, so that's exciting. But no, definitely putting the website link that you put in there, checking, making sure state registrations. Most of the products listed will go mostly everywhere, excluding maybe California and some of those far northeastern states.
So I'm actually on that Q&A on Taylor's question. I am including the link for vegetationmanagement.com, bareground.com as well. And of course, as everybody can see, we have some great specialists on the team. There's Tanner, Katie, there's myself, and feel free to always reach out to your local rep. And as Tanner and Katie both said earlier in the presentation, if one of us doesn't know, the odds are pretty high that somebody else does. So we're all one big group, we're one big team. So that hits that question. Another question that we have, guys, is there a preferred time of the year for TVC applications? So there's spring, summer, fall. I know, Tanner, you went over a few of this earlier, but do you mind summarizing just in a quick sentence on what you guys think?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it is going to depend, but I will say, generally speaking, fall is going to be preferred out of any season you could do, just because um, you probably only need pre-emergent chemistries in the tank, so you're reducing the amount of actives that you need to have. So maybe it cheapens it up a little bit. You're going to have more confidence being in front of moisture, which is like Katie's point. It's critical to have that about a quarter inch to a half inch to activate. So in really dry landscapes, that's important. Spring is kind of the next one to consider. The earlier you can get out, considering, I might have some frozen soils and some snow. So waiting for those to dissipate before going out, but being as early as possible. And that's another reason why I like fall better, because the window is going to be a lot longer. Some of the areas that I work in, our spring might last 2, 3 weeks. And that's hard to get a lot of acres done. So fall preferred, spring second, summer, Katie mentioned, as soon as things are coming out of the ground, you have to attack that ground very differently. It's going to need a lot more water. It's going to need a lot more chemistry. You're going to be chasing it. You're not going to be in front of it.
We actually had a question just pop up from Justin. He's asking, how can you find out about the cost per acre for high noon and the Piper combo?
Great, I can take that one. The best thing to do at any time it comes to price is reach out to a chemical supplier in your area. They'll be able to really hone in on what those dollars and cents are going to be for your program. Generally speaking, a high noon and a Piper Easy combination at max rates is going to be near that $100 per acre. And I'm talking probably plus or minus $20, depending on what adjuvants you're going to be putting in, shipping costs, all that stuff. There's going to be a lot of considerations to be made, but generally speaking, you're going to be around that $100 an acre.
Great. Okay, so another question that we have is any suggestions or thoughts on handling herbicides that are resistant or herbicide resistant weeds like kochia?
I can take that, Tanner. So Tanner mentioned, the best time to avoid resistance is that before it comes up. The smaller it is, the less likely we are to have those issues. And so pre-emergent actives are by far the best way to avoid resistance management. Most of the time when we see resistance coming in, it's in those post burn down products. So again, it gets back to different modes of action in the tank, different actives. I think we get caught up in like, oh, how many different actives do we have in the tank? But are we really using different modes of action? Is probably more critical than per se the actives. And then again, understanding that faster isn't always better. The last thing we want is for a plant to look burnt and crispy and then for it to grow out of it because it systematically did not move through the plants like it should have. And so ways to avoid that is proper timing. As soon as kochia, Russian thistle, kochia specifically, or even pigweed species start getting large, and what I mean by that is taller than me, you have to start upping your rates of product to get it knocked down. And that is when it starts getting very costly to control it. So then we see this instance where we start skimping on rates because we need to be more cost sensitive and budget friendly, but we're not actually spraying at the appropriate rates. And so that's where timing is critical. Pre-emergent, pre-germination is the best way to avoid that. But if you had to use a post product using multiple modes of action, and timing of this actual size of the plant would be key best management practices.
So final question that we have here for now is, do we have to wait for ground to get above a certain temperature to begin applications?
Yeah, I can take that one. Um, I would be more cognizant of, do I have frozen ground or snow present? I do not want to make applications there. One, it's not effective, and two, it's usually not legal on these labels. So you can pay really close attention to soil temp, but sometimes just a good observation of, have I thawed? And understandably, in some regions, you're going to have a freeze thaw cycle there in spring, and it's okay to spray chemical and then have it freeze, which is why we do it in the fall. But we don't want to make application on a day where there's frozen material. So you want to be out as early as possible for good weed performance, but you also want to wait until, if we're talking spring, you want to wait until the ground has thawed.
Perfect. That's going to be all the questions for now, you guys. Any closing statements
Awesome.
before we let everybody
Yeah,
go?
Dave, appreciate you taking over that section. Folks, encourage you to reach out to us if you're not already working with your current Corteva rep. Let us help in areas where things start to get tricky in your program. We'd be glad to take a look at that. Can't thank you enough for joining us. Apologize, we went a little bit over the hour. If you want to see more of this content, you should see an email in your inbox here in a couple weeks with the video, and we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Thanks and have a great day.